Well, thank you for joining us today, Anthony. Very glad to have you on the show. Before we get into a lot of the indoor facility, the finer points of indoor facility design, I wanted to just talk a bit about your background. And of course, you come from events and power and lighting worlds. Just wanted to get a sense from you of what led you to cannabis a few years back.
Yeah, so I started the company. We just celebrated 6 years of being in business, but I'm a licensed electrical engineer and started out just doing residential and commercial electrical engineering for buildings, basically. And as time went on, people would ask, "Hey, do you do HVAC and plumbing?" And one day I just said yes, and I figured out the right resources to make that happen. And then in 2017, when it became legal here in California, I started getting asked, "Hey, can you do a cannabis facility?" And I'm not turning anything down, so I said yes. I took an approach of it's like any other building. And then as you continue to do design work, you realize that it's really not, especially cultivation. It's kind of its own beast. So I started just doing a really deep dive into the MEP systems. And for those who don't know what that means, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, to fully understand what the growers need. And my name started getting out there. I think I spoke at the Cannabis Business Times conference in 2019 or 2018. And it's just kind of been going from there. A lot of great referrals, and we're out there just marketing, trying to be that go-to MEP engineering firm across the country.
Yeah, and early on, maybe some of the things that growers need are kind of obvious, but what was that learning curve like for you? And what did you find that growers were looking for that might be different from facilities in other industries?
Yeah, so they really have to dial in their needs. So here's two things. So you have to bring together this world that's been underground for so long. You got these growers who've been doing it for 20 some odd years, and they have what they believe is their magic to growing the best cannabis on earth, right? And then you have the engineering side, which is a lot of analytics, a lot of data. And when one of the first facilities we did, they were like, "Oh, we need a set point of X, Y, and Z, humidity X, Y, and Z." And we went to doing calculations like we normally did, and the grower came back and was like, "What are you doing? Like, we need half the amount of tonnage in the room based on our experience." And so at that point I was like, you know what, I'm going to lean heavily going forward on the growers because they know what they want. So I had them sign an agreement saying, "Hey, if something happens to your plants, that's on you." Now, when it comes to human safety in the building, nobody can dictate that but us. But those are, that's one of the biggest hurdles, is trying to dial in and appease those growers who think they have the magic, along with the engineering side of things. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's a plant, right? So.
Yeah, early on, out in California, were you seeing a lot of new builds at all, or was this a lot of retrofits that you were encountering in those early years?
I'd probably say 70% of our work is TI, so tenant improvements. People are moving into existing warehouses. Just because the cost of construction, especially in California for a new build, is extremely expensive. You're dealing with the environmental agencies out here will really put you through it, and that can blow your budget substantially.
And has that ratio changed much at all? I guess whether it's retrofits or new builds, have these facilities changed dramatically over the last few years? I know the industry in general moves pretty quickly, but are you seeing different styles of facility than you were a couple years ago?
I don't think necessarily the style has changed, because it's pretty basic, right? You start with your seedlings, you go into veg, you go into flower, you trim, you dry, boom, you got a product. So not much of that has changed. I think the ancillary, I can never get that word right, ancillary services and data around it has been evolving, right? So we just did a sustainability webinar where we had a gentleman come on and talk about ways that his company can save on consumption from the HVAC systems, right? So realizing, I think people are realizing very quickly that these facilities suck up a lot of power and it's not sustainable. And there's tons of open space in this country to continue to build, but it's going to stress out our electrical grid, and we really have to get into renewable energy, or else we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, and I'll point out too that the word facility, I have to sort of take my time with that one. Pretty easy to trip over as we're talking about facilities. But so bearing that in mind with the electrical grid and wanting to make sure that you're finding the right place and implementing the right changes to that facility, what are some of the initial questions that growers are asking you, or you're asking growers about site selection specifically?
Yeah, so that's one of the services we offer, where we will go to a site, I don't care where it is, we'll fly out to wherever and evaluate an existing space that you plan to rent or buy. And the reason I started offering that is because we've had facilities where they've signed the contract, the lease, or whatever the case may be, bring us on, and then you don't have enough power. So we have to work with what you have, which one time we did a project in Long Beach, and it was enough power that you typically see at a single family home. Or if you want to upgrade, it could be 6 months to a year before Edison or whoever your local power company can get to you and actually do the construction to bring you the power. So we do site visits and site evaluations to, determine, do you have enough power on site? One. Two, where's your HVAC equipment going to go, right? If it's an older building, maybe the roof is not structurally sound enough to put it up there. And if that's the case, do you have proper setbacks to put it outside? So it's a lot of different questions like that you really have to get answered before you pull the trigger on a lease or a purchase on a building.
Sort of along similar lines, I know we briefly mentioned just the heat out west in the Pacific Northwest, and we're recording this interview in late June. And maybe this is sort of a broader conversation that just enters into the picture in many industries. But with indoor facilities in cannabis, and with just the climate conversation and heat in general, heat waves, from an engineering perspective, does that, I guess, what are the considerations that you'll want to keep in mind when working in a region that might be facing severe heat throughout the summer?
So there's a couple sides of that, right? The first is, especially if you're working in California, due to all the wildfires, I forget the name of the program, but there's a shutdown where if the wind kicks up, so let's take it back even further. When you have power lines, right, as it gets hotter outside, they start to sag, right? So when they sag, the wind blows, it can whip out, it can cause fire. So power companies can actually shut down the power if the wind is gets a little gusty, because they're so concerned about setting another fire, and folks have died in the past. So you have that where they shut down your power. Now what are you going to do? So out here, you need to really consider having battery backup, solar, and a backup generator, so that you can be on your own microgrid, so that you're not affected when these things happen. Also, when it comes to being out here, and so I think this is important no matter what, having the proper insulation in your grow space. I think that's really critical, controlling the humidity, because if it's really dry outside, and depending on the types of lights that you're using, and then your plants perspire, so you really have to dial those numbers in. But my biggest concern is being out here and the power company shut you down, because if you're down for a couple hours, who knows how that can affect your plants.
Yeah, it seems like so much of the conversation around design leads to a conversation about the future, and of course risk management, contingency planning, things like that. On a more positive side, planning for the future in terms of future growth or scaling or even expanding a facility, what sort of conversations need to happen early on to accommodate future expansions on a facility, or just different changes to that facility over time?
Yeah, so you really have to do a lot of future planning with your power system, because the last thing you want to do is go through that same process of upgrading over again, and that can get pretty costly the utility doesn't even have the proper structures in place. And when I say structures, that means an actual transformer that's big enough to supply you what you need. Otherwise, they're going to have to bring in bigger structures. And a lot of times, that cost somehow gets passed on to you. So really dialing in what your future needs are as early as you possibly can. I know that's sometimes difficult, but it's better to, I guess, to overestimate than to underestimate. Also understanding what you're bringing on the proper civil engineering team, understanding your drainage and all that good stuff. So really the big thing is future planning for your power.
Yeah, maybe sort of dialing that down a bit to something that's maybe less major, but or maybe less visible perhaps, but certainly important. One thing I always think about in facilities is just like traffic flow from room to room of foot traffic, but also carts or whatever people might be moving around the facility. How should a grower, or how should a business rather, think about that when planning the blueprint of a facility? Without, again, there's a lot of similarities from facility to facility, but that movement among hallways and from room to room, how does that get figured into these plans?
So that's usually not in our realm. That's usually when you start in the beginning before you get to us, right? I always tell people you need to find a cannabis consultant who understands facilities, or architect, because eventually you're going to have to get an architect, or an architect who understands that, because you have to think about cross-contamination and make sure things don't, proper negative and positive, or positive pressure and negative pressure and all those types of things, so that things don't go from room to room to room, and now you're kind of screwed because your whole crop has been affected. And also making sure that your hallways are wide enough, making sure that you don't have a ton of doors in the hallways, right? So you have employees touching stuff. So that's really important. And honestly, with COVID, that really at the top of people's minds now is touchless systems. So.
Yeah, and sort of with that in mind, I know sometimes there's a tendency to think that bigger is better, and maybe that is part of the future planning as well. But when working with you guys, have you run across a lot of folks who are either working with facilities that are too large for their needs, or how does that assessment work?
I've never had anybody say it's too large. I've always heard something is maybe too small, and then they start getting into going, multiple tiers and things like that. But in terms of too big, I haven't heard that one yet. And I'm sure it happens, especially when you start seeing that first power bill, or, you got to have a good understanding of your manpower and how do you man all these grows and things like that.
Yeah, and that brings up just the vertical growing aspect too, which, a lot of companies do work with. Does height in a room change a lot of the equations that we're talking about here, with whether it's power or HVAC, especially as you get up to three racks or possibly even more in some cases?
Yeah, you definitely want a couple things. You want to make sure you have the proper airflow, and that's whether you have single tier or multi-tiered. But then two, when you start adding multiple tiers, you have to understand how far the lights can be to the plant. And there are some folks out there who are still using HPS, which is high pressure sodium lights, which get very, very hot. So that means you can't bring the lights as close to the plants as you can with LED. So then it becomes an issue of, all right, how high is my ceiling? And that can really be the limiting factor of how high you can go.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of these conversations more than likely are happening at the start of the process or a little ways into the process as the facility design is coming together. But longer term, could you talk a bit about the importance of maintenance, or any red flags to watch out for 3, 4, 5, 6 years down the road?
One of the big things that, and this is something I have a friend of mine who owns his own HVAC company, and this is circling back to that example I gave of the client wanting us to undersize the HVAC units more than what we were comfortable with, is that when you do that, you're stressing out your HVAC equipment, so then you're having to replace it much sooner. So you as the grower or investor or whoever, you have to draw kind of walk that fine line of, all right, future replacement or stress it out now, grow as much as I can and get my money as quickly as I can. So that's the big thing. Also, I mean, make sure that your HVAC equipment is serviced at the appropriate intervals, because the last thing you want is summertime, especially out here in Southern California, your equipment breaks down and you can't find an HVAC tech, because HVAC technicians are extremely busy in the summertime out here in Southern California. So those are, I'd say that is the real big one.
Yeah, that's a really good, easily overlooked point, especially when it gets a little too late.
Yeah.
Well, looking ahead to Cannabis Conference, in August, I know we've covered a lot of ground already, but what are you hoping that attendees in your session can take away and take home to their business and maybe put into effect pretty quickly?
I think my goal is to educate folks as much as possible, so that by the time they get to a professional such as myself, they already have everything that they need. Because quite often I get folks who come to me and say, hey, I want to do a 10,000 square foot grow in Oakland or whatever the location. I'm like, well, do you have architectural drawings? And they're like, no. I'm like, well, as MEP engineers, we don't draw the buildings. We implement the components within inside the building. So understanding that and having those right resources, that's really what's important for me. And then, like I mentioned before, if you're moving into an existing facility, understand those things that you need to look out for, because I'd hate for you to sign the lease and then you're stuck, right? And then you have to do some expensive retrofits and things like that, which blow your budget out the water.
No doubt about that. Well, it's always, it's one of those sessions that's been sort of recurring at Cannabis Conference. We're very pleased to have you aboard for this one.
Appreciate it.
It's always a really cool conversation with a lot of good Q&A too. A lot of small issues that can quickly become big, and a lot of big issues that, remain big, I suppose. There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Anthony. It was great to talk to you here. Looking forward to seeing you out in Vegas in August.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Definitely. Thanks so much. Have a good one.
You too. Bye.
Bye.